Hi everyone, BritSimon here. So this video is going to be all about the UK entries in DV2026. I'm pleased that we can now say that we've got DV entries, winning entries in DV26. As you know, this has come about because of a lawsuit that I filed against the government when it became clear to me that that they had messed up the draw process for DV25 and DV26. They messed up the draw because, in case you don't know, I'll give you a very quick recap. Basically, the government messed up the draw because they didn't add in the UK to the list of eligible countries when they were doing the draw process, and that meant that we didn't get any winners selected for either DV 2025 or DV 2026 from the UK, which was supposed to be newly eligible. In DV 2025, on August the 8th, I think it was, the government announced that they had realized that they had messed up and that they contacted some winners, and they contacted about 43 cases, families, and individuals, to let them know that they were now selected in DV 2025. There was then a flurry of activity, and several of those cases, probably about half of those cases, actually did process their visa applications and got their visas, so will now get their green cards as soon as they enter the USA. So that was tremendously successful. However, the government continued to want to fight us on DV 2026. We said, the same problem that you have caused in DV 2025, you've caused in DV 26. And they said, no, we haven't. It's all lovely. It obviously wasn't all lovely. And so just yesterday, we filed, fairly early in the morning, we filed an amended complaint of the lawsuit to keep the lawsuit going, to say, okay, we're now going to fight you for DV 2026. And we added some plaintiffs onto that lawsuit. So instead of just being my lawsuit representing my daughter, it now represents an additional, I think it is 11 entrants that all had entered DV 2026. So that gave us a reason to continue formally to actually have standing. It's called standing. To give us a reason to continue the argument with the government about DV 2026 and make sure that the same solution for DV 2026 happened, the same as DV 2025. Then yesterday evening, magic happened. I started being contacted by one and then a second person who said, hey, weird things happened. I've been selected from the UK. And people who had seen that they had not previously been selected in the May announcement of the results saw that they had been selected. So I created a video update, let people know to go check their results, and hey presto, we now have, as of today, I know of a number of cases, significant number of cases, that have been selected. But, and there is a fairly big but here, the case number range of those cases goes from early case numbers, normal case numbers, right up to the highest case number I've heard of, which is 189,000, which in EU is a completely nutty case number. And it would be nutty in any of the regions, frankly. But some of you won't understand the import of what that case number means and how that case number comes about and how that case number drives your chances. And so I thought it was probably going to be valuable to sort of do a bit of a primer on how this process works, to get you to sort of understand that, yes, you may be a selectee, but your chances of actually going forward are not necessarily as high as you might think. So let me show you a little presentation I've put together that I think is going to help explain this. Let me do slideshow. Haven't used this in a while, PowerPoint. So let me just go back and Yeah, let me just share this. Whoops, add to stage. There we go. Here we go. Okay, so this is going to be an explanation of how the draw process works. Some of you will find this interesting regardless of your region, but I've mainly tailored this for the EU region, right? Now, when the lottery period of entry, the entry period is open, there's an amount of entries, which I've said in the past could be around about 1 million entries, could be 2 million entries or whatever. But actually, I think the number we should use is something around about 4 million entries from EU. Okay, every region has its own entries. So Africa will have several million, probably 5, 6, 7 million. EU has, I think, probably around about 4 million, although it goes up and down each year. Sometimes there's more interest in the lottery, sometimes there's less interest in the lottery for various reasons, right? And I can show you actually the data from which I'm taking this 4 million number. But it's not without, although it's not an official number, it's not without some sense, right? There is some sense to it. So there would be 4 million individual entries. Each entry includes the person entering the lottery plus the derivatives, the spouse, the kids, and that sort of thing, right? So each of those 4 million entries would be randomized into a random order and then numerically ordered from 1 to 4 million. Okay, that's the first step in the DV lottery draw process. That's actually how the draw works, right? So if we assumed that there was a 1% chance of initial selection, they would be looking for 40,000 cases from 4 million cases and to call them winners, right? And I'll go through and explain this in a minute. But if there was a 1% chance, roughly 1 in 100-year chance, that's what they would be looking for. They would be looking for about 40,000 cases on 4 million entries, right? And so we would have a block of cases. If you can imagine this tower here is from case number 1 to 4 million. Every single case would be ordered in its numeric order, which was assigned to every case, not based on any particular factor, not based on the education level of the person or the day they entered, or the day of the week or the time they entered the lottery, not based on anything, completely random. These entries would be randomized in an order and then numbered. And so it's a completely random ordering process that gives us 4 million cases ordered from 1 to 4 million, right? The next step, if I do, whoops, hang on a second, sorry, add that back to stage. I didn't know I could do that. The next step would be here. The next step is to look at DV2026. So imagine we've still got our 4 million entries, but in order to find our selectees, they would then pick the EU selectees in a case number range from 1 to, let's say, 50,000, right? Now, we don't know this actual number at this point, but I'm pretty sure, because we've done a poll, I'm pretty sure that the number is around about 47, 48,000, maybe 50,000. So we'll call it 50,000. Thank you, Han. We'll call it 50,000 as a rough approximation. So if we had our tool building here, our EU entries, it would only be the first 50,000 entries out of the 4 million that would be considered selectees. Okay, so now that 50,000 number is before they start rejecting cases because of invalid photos or fraudulent entries, double entries, that sort of thing. And so roughly a half of the 50,000, maybe even a little bit more than half of the 50,000 would be rejected out of that group even before the announcement of the results in May. Okay, so we would end up with something like 20,000, maybe 25,000 cases in a 50,000 number range, right? So there would be, let's say, 20,000 cases spread out over a 50,000 number range. Does that make sense? That means that there's going to be some holes, some gaps in the number range. It's not going to be consecutive numbers. It won't be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It won't be consecutive. There will be gaps, which I call holes in between the case numbers. So you'll hear people in the DV community talk about holes, and that holes comes from a word I decided to call this holes years ago when I started sort of explaining this concept to people. And so now we all call it holes. So there's going to be something like 25 to 30,000 holes, which are numbers that don't pertain to actual real cases. And those were cases that were disqualified for various reasons during the draw process. And actually people who had those numbers, let's say case number 23 as a whole, when case number 23 entry went into the entry status checking site back in May, they would have seen you have not been selected, which is the same message that case number 4 million would have seen, right? Nobody knows whether they had a low case number but were rejected, as opposed to an impossibly high case number, which was never going to have a chance anyway. Nobody knows the difference, right? The only people that saw anything different are those that saw a letter that says, congratulations, you've been selected. And then they see their case number and they can see roughly where they appear in that 50,000 range. Let's say it's 50,000, in that 50,000 range, and they know roughly where they are, but they still don't know how many people are selected in their region. I'll come to that a little bit later. Okay. Now, as the process goes on throughout the year, we ignore the rest of these, the 4 million cases that are not in the 50,000. We only think about the cases that have been selected, of course. And the visa bulletin then moves the processing up by numeric ranges. So, for example, in the first month of DV2026, the EU number has been set in the visa bulletin at 7,750, meaning you have to be at case number 7,750, well, actually below that number, in order to have a chance of being interviewed in October. That number was then repeated for November, and so again, you had to be under 7,750 in order to have a chance of being interviewed. That number is then going to be gradually increased, okay, towards the 50,000 number, but not necessarily completely to the 50,000 number. There could be, and there usually is, a limit placed on the number before the end of the year. We see that limit being applied in the visa bulletin that's published next July. And that visa bulletin, which is actually called the August visa bulletin, that visa bulletin affects the cases that are eligible for interview in September of next year, which is the 12th month of processing for DV 2026. Okay, so hope you're with me so far. So what's happened is that the UK selectees are in a range from, roughly speaking, from case number 1, I assume, up to almost case number 200,000. It could even be higher than that. I don't know exactly. The only thing I know is that at the moment, the highest case number I know has been selected is 189,000. So I'm assuming that, roughly speaking, they're in the 200,000 range. So it's kind of weird when the rest of EU is only selected up to 50,000, that that we have cases up to 200,000 selected for EU. But some of you, therefore, have got case numbers like case number 160,000 or 150,000 or 130,000, and you're wondering, I'm sure, whether your case number is good or not. Well, the reality is, if you're at case number 150,000 or 180,000 or something like that, your case number is not good. It is far in excess of the EU numbers, and therefore it's significantly at risk. Okay. So if and how will this work? Well, the cutoff that I mentioned that would apply in July of next year will be at some point in that first 50,000 range, I'm guessing. Now, it's not 100% certain it will go exactly like this, but it'll probably stay below the 50,000. I'll show you why in a moment. I'll show you why I'm saying that. But I think it's going to be less than 50,000. Now, I don't really know for sure that that's going to be the case, because I don't know how many selectees there are in EU as a whole or the globe as a whole. I also don't know what's going to happen with the travel ban. I don't know exactly what will happen, with processing over the next few months and so on. but I'm pretty sure that we're not going to see the visa bulletin go current. And I'll show you that word in a moment, what that means. So that's why I'm thinking there will be a cutoff in place next year. Okay, let me show you that. So essentially there's going to be a cutoff, as you can see in my little graphic here, which will be at the beginning up to probably 50,000 or so, some number less than 50,000, maybe at 30,000 or 25,000 or 35,000 or something, but it won't go to the 200,000 range, which means if you've got a case number higher than that final cutoff that is published in July, then you have no ability to be scheduled for an interview. You can't adjust your status in the US. You can't process your case. It's like you were told you were a winner, but actually you weren't really a winner. It was a hollow victory, as I've said to someone today. Okay. Let me show you a little bit of sort of supporting information that that I think might be interesting to you. Now, where have I got some of these numbers from? Well, firstly, in terms of those cutoff numbers I mentioned that would be published in July, I've tracked this data for a number of years. I've got data going all the way back to the 90s. But if you look at recent years, let's look at DV25, for example. DV25 started off at 6,000 in the first month, which was October interviews. And then went to 6,000 again, 6,000 again. Then it moved up to 12,000 for a couple of months, 13, then 16,000 and so on. And in the end, the final number for EU in DV 2025 was 23,000, right? That was I consider that to be an extremely low number. Actually, they ended up wasting visas. They've wasted about 5,000 visas in DV25, not just in the EU, but globally. And that's partly to do with that number being so ridiculously low, okay? If we look at DV24, you can see the number finished up at 50,000. 50,000 was ridiculously high. It was kind of senseless, really. Between 30,000 and 50,000, very, very few cases got scheduled. The number was just too high. 50,000 was just a joke, really, in a sense. Not very funny joke given to us by the government. But it did help some people. Some people were able to adjust status, and some people were able to process their cases. But in terms of the percentage of people that got helped between that 30,000 number and the 50,000 number, the number was extremely low. Very, very small percentage of cases, right? In the previous year, you can see there was a cutoff at 32,000. That's DV23. In DV22, 21, and 2020, the numbers went current, and I'll explain what current means. Current means that any number of any range in that region can get interviewed. And that might give some of you some excitement if you've got a case number of 180,000 for a UK winner. But the conditions that have to exist in order for the case numbers to go current is basically there are more visas available than there are people who want them, right? And that's not very likely to be the case in DV 2026. Although, to be fair, I can't sort of absolutely confirm that at the moment because we don't know the number of selectees, right? Now, in terms of the number of selectees, you'll see that I track that on a yearly basis as well. Within Europe, we're looking at Europe right now in this particular tab. This is from my my blog, by the way, BritSimonSays.com. You can see this this exact data on BritSimonSays.com, and just go to the historical visa bulletin numbers tab, or link rather from my site. Now you can see the number of people selected in each year for the region of EU in this case, and for the global number of selected. So in DV25, there are 131,000 people selected, 43,000 of those being from EU. Now remember, 43,000 is people, not cases. So that those 43,000 people appeared on about 20,000 cases, and 20,000 cases in DV25. I think the highest case number was 41,000 that was assigned but the cutoff in July was 23,000. So cases between 23,000 and 41,000 were all out of luck, right? In DV24, there were 50,000 people selected, which was probably about 23,000 cases in EU, 143,000 almost selected for the globe as a whole. The final number was published to 50,000, although, as I say, I can show you the data that would show very, very few cases actually got interviewed in that sort of top 20,000 numbers. And there were a few more cases above 50,000 that didn't get current. So, I think the highest case number in DV24 was about 56,000. That's one aspect of what I want you to understand, the sort of the cutoff numbers and the relationship to the number of selectees in each year for the region and for the globe as a whole. And you'll see that forgetting 2020, 21, and 22, these years were sort of affected badly by the COVID pandemic. That changed things rapidly and very profoundly. And so the fact that these 3 years all went current is only because of COVID. Prior to that, DV 2019 was sort of a normal year, but there were only 30,000 people selected in that year from Europe, and only 87,000 for the globe as a whole, right? So if we compare those numbers to how many they've been selecting in recent years, the selectee numbers are a lot higher now than they used to be. And again, you can go back and have a look at all this history. It's all tracked there for you. But when they select a lot of people, that's bad news in terms of, the region's not likely to go current. But we can't really be 100% sure what's going to happen during the year, and I'll come to that in a moment. We can't be 100% sure how things are going to go, but we can be reasonably confident that if a lot of people are selected, then there is likely to be a problem at the in the final months. There's not going to be everybody being current, right? Okay, so that's probably a little bit, maybe hopefully that information is sort of making sense to you. The other thing I wanted to show you was the number of selectees. I mentioned that there would be 4 million entries in EU in DV26. That's a guess on my part, but it's somewhat underlined by the number. Now, we have this web page that is official data that shows us the number of selectees, the number of entries, the number of winning issuances in each country each year, and so on. And so if we look at the last available data, unfortunately, they've only got the data up until 2021. But if we look at that data in 2020, 2019, 2020, and 21, you look at a three-column block of data, and you can see for the region of Europe, let's say for Sweden, the way to read this data is 5,684 people from Sweden entered the lottery, and that included 4,178 derivatives on those entries, right? Meaning a total of 9,800 people from Sweden entered DV 2019. Then you can look at the next three columns. You can see the same number for DV 2020, right? You see at the top there. And then finally at DV 2021, you can see those numbers there. Now, the total for Europe is nicely sort of, summarized for us and totaled up for us here. So in DV 2019, there were 4.3 million entries with 3.2 million derivatives, that's spouse and children, for a total of 7.6 million people involved in the lottery in DV 2019. That number dropped a lot in DV 2020, went down, not a lot, sorry. It went down to 7 million, just a little bit less in 2020, and dropped a lot in 2021. This was an unusually, DV 2021 was an unusually quiet year. There were a couple of changes in that year, as well as the COVID pandemic. And so the numbers were low. But I'm expecting this year, DV 2026, to have been more like DV 2019 in terms of numbers. So I'm assuming that EU would have about 4 million entries. Okay, that would equate, by the way, if we looked at a global total, that would equate to a published number of about 22.5 million people involved in that for all the regions combined together. So if the government publish numbers that says there was something between 20 and 25 million people on the lottery, what they mean is they mean that number would be about between 20 and 25 million. So somewhat less than that in terms of entrants, and then derivatives less than that, right? So that's how I get to the idea that there are 4 million entries. So what does it all mean? Hopefully you understand the draw process in terms of what's happened in terms of the draw, and you can understand that based on poll data, we've asked the public to tell us what case numbers they have, and people have given us feedback. And for EU, and let me go and I'll show you that. I think it's a DV26 poll. Yeah, there we go. So let me show you this data as well. We can see that if we look at the EU region, you can see here, if I just make this a little bit bigger, I'm sure this needs to be bigger. Yeah. Okay. So we're looking at EU entries. So what this is data that has come in from the public, from winners, where they've told us what their case number is, or at least the range of it, right? And so we can see that there are sort of good, reliable statistics up to about 50,000, right? 48 to 49,000. There are two people that reported their numbers as being in the 48 to 49,000 range. There's one person that says they had a 56 to 57,000 range. I kind of ignore that one. I think that's a mistake or a joke or something. And again, there's somebody who says they've got a 70,000 range. I don't believe that either. I'm fairly confident that the EU case numbers go up to about 50,000, which is why I was explaining that a few moments ago. And I now know that the UK entries go up to about 190,000, maybe 200,000. So we'll take 200,000 as the number. So roughly speaking, that means that there are that the entries for UK have been over publicized, shall we say, over selected by roughly 4 times, right? Because I should expect numbers up to 50,000. We've got numbers up to 200,000. So roughly speaking, that's about 4 times more winners than we should have, right? Now, I'm able to also back into that number another way, because I know of roughly about 200 cases through people that have contacted me over the UK lawsuit, and various ways. We've got about 200 people that I know entered DV 2026, and of those 200, it appears that we have something like 10 to 12 selectees from that 200 numbers. So roughly speaking, a 10% chance of selection, right? It shouldn't be anything like that. It should be much less than that. Actually, it's not quite that, is it? 10 out of 200, no, sorry, 5% chance of selection, right? Roughly speaking, 4 times more, again, than the 1 to 1.25% that I expect, okay? So that kind of confirms that we've got 4 times as many selectees as we should have for the UK. And we know that the number range is up to about 4 times more than it should be. That means that if you're in that sort of top set of cases from, let's say, 50,000 to 200,000, or whatever case number above 50,000, your case number is significantly at risk. It's as if you've been told you're a winner, but actually you haven't got a chance of being interviewed. There's very little chance you'll be interviewed. The only way that you could be interviewed if you've got a case number of 170, 180,000 is if the region were to go current, right? Now, what does it take for that to happen? Well, like I mentioned earlier, it means there should be less people who want the visa than, or are able to get approved for the visa, than there are visas available. Is that likely to happen in DV2026? I don't think so, but there are some factors that could help that. The travel bans implemented by the Trump administration will have impacted to a great extent people in the Asia region and people to a lesser extent in the Africa region. About 25,000, maybe as many as 30,000 people globally will be affected by the travel bans. Now, I don't know if the travel ban is going to stay in place for this whole year or not, right? But if it were to stay in place for the whole year, then there would be about 25 to 30,000 people out of some number we don't know that could not process their cases. And in that scenario, there would be a lot of leftover visas, and Europe could take more of those visas, right? So it could be that if the travel ban stays in place, and that would be a terrible thing, frankly, for a lot of people. That would be heartbreaking for a lot of people who have been, have really should have the same chance as anyone else to process their case. But in that heartbreaking scenario, it would be good news for higher case numbers in the UK region, because the UK is more likely to go to a higher case number range if the government wants to do that, right? Now, it might mean that instead of cutting off at 30,000 or 35,000 or 25,000, maybe they go to 45,000, but maybe they go current, right? Maybe the people who have the power to decide whether to make the region current or not don't really understand the impact of making the region current with all of the UK entries. So there is a small chance, and it's a fairly small chance, but there's a small chance, depending on what happens this year, and particularly depending on the travel ban, that maybe the region goes current. And if you see the word current, then the fact that you're at 180,000 doesn't make any difference anymore. Your case is as good as someone who's got a case number 1, right? When you see current for the region, that's what that means, right? It means any number can be interviewed, is eligible for interview, and all the numbers are essentially the same as each other. Although there is a natural sort of benefit given to lower case numbers in the final months when they go current in some months. Then essentially all bets are off, and everybody's got the same sort of chance from that point forward. So there is a bit of a sort of a snowball's chance in hell that happens. I don't see it as that likely, but I simply don't know. I don't know what the impact of the travel ban is going to be. I also don't know, by the way, how many selectees we have in DV 2026. It's possible that we have case numbers up to 50,000, but a lot of holes. I mentioned holes earlier. The holes are created by automated processes, mainly photo rejections. And it's possible that there are a lot more holes in this year than there have been in previous years. And so although we've got case numbers up to 50,000 in the EU, maybe we've got less selectees than we normally would expect. We don't know that number yet because for the last 2 visa bulletins, the government should have published, in one or the other of them, they should have published the number of selectees. But for some reason, they haven't done that. That reason is probably because they had screwed up the whole UK entry process, and they didn't want to publicize that information because they didn't want to give me more evidence to use in my lawsuit. I'm seriously thinking that's quite a possibility, and that's exactly what they would have done if they'd have given me that. If they'd have given us that data, it would have shown either that they did have selectees in the UK or they didn't, or that they had selectees in Cuba, which they shouldn't have in DV26. They shouldn't have any Cuban selectees, and I know they have got some. And so it would have revealed the error that they've made in DV2026. For that reason, they've held back from publishing that data. And I think now they've released the UK winners, we're probably going to see in the next visa bulletin, which will be published in about a week's time, a week to 10 days time. When we see that published, I wouldn't be at all surprised if we then now see the corrected number of selectees in each country, including the UK winners. All right. And when we see that number is going to look fairly high for the UK because, like I've mentioned, they've selected 4 times more people than they should have selected, right? Had they have kept in line with the rest of the EU in terms of number ranges, etc. So, so I'm hoping that that's all making sense to you. I'm kind of stunned, to be honest with you, that the government have managed to screw this up. Some people think the American government are an extremely well-run. If you don't live in America, you might not have a complete clue of how badly run this country is. This is a country that thrives and does well and is amazing to live in, etc. But that all happens despite crappy government and despite awful, bad, simple mistakes that are made like this all the time. I've been watching the government make a hash up of this process for years and years and years. And this is just another example of how a simple task can be turned into a complete shambles by people that don't really understand what the hell they're doing. And that's essentially what's going on at the moment. And I'm shocked that we're in this position. I'm shocked, frankly, that they managed to mess up the whole UK entry thing in the first place. But to mess that up and then do this mistake as well is just embarrassing beyond belief. I mean, it's just amazing to me that they've done that. Shocking. But I don't think there's any. Some of you, I'm sure, will ascribe some sort of logical reason. Oh, perhaps they've done this to say sorry to the UK entries or something. I've already heard that one. That's just not the case. This is incompetence, nothing more than incompetence. It's stupidity or incompetence, however you want to put it. It's just that. It's nothing. They're not trying to be nice. They're not trying to be nice to me or to you because of the lawsuit. This is just pure stupidity and incompetence at play here. So there you go. So, and if you are watching from the visa office or from KCC, it's not really KCC's fault. But if you're watching from any of the places that are running this, I'm sorry for my harsh words about your piss poor attempt at running this process, but you deserve it, and you deserve the harsh comments. And I'd be more than happy to have sat down with you some months ago, as I asked for you to do, for me to help you correct this effing mess. And you chose not to do that, and so therefore you cost me several $1,000s of my money and other people's money in order to make you do the right thing. So I'm sorry, I'm just not in the mood to say, oh, you've done such a good job, thank you very much. You've done a piss poor job. And I am grateful with how the government handled the DV2026 selectees, but under duress of the lawsuit, that was done, right? And now, yesterday, you waited till we filed the complaint, making it clear once again that you'd screwed up DV2026, and then, and only then, did you release the entries. What a bunch of muppets you really are, right? Honestly, you should get an award for the biggest bunch of muppets out there. So unbelievable. And really, at this point, I have to say, last thing I'll say is it's kind of cruel what you've done. You've told people who don't know very much about this process that they're winners. I've been receiving emails from people all day who I've had to go back to and say, yeah, you're a winner, but not really. And I've had to explain what I'm explaining in this video. And that's cruel. You're messing around with people's lives. I don't understand how you can do that and be so careless as to not use some common sense to actually think this stuff through before you go press a button. And you've had all this time. I filed the lawsuit in June, right? Early June. I was contacting you in February of this year. I asked for a FOIA request, which you've never bloody well answered, by the way. You know, you deserve the title of biggest bunch of Muppets because you're screwing things up like a bunch of Muppets. So, you know, sorry, but get it right and stop being such an ineffective bunch of fools. Anyway, hopefully that gets through to the right ears. I doubt it somehow, but and if you want to contact me, you know, Mr. McIgnol, you know, director of KCC, you've got my email address. I've tried to contact you several times. You have my email address. You're very welcome to set up a meeting. I'd be more than happy to explain exactly how you're effing things up, you know, every single day of the week, including, by the way, not answering the phone for the last 4 years since you turned off the phone so that nobody can even phone you anymore. So, you know, get it together, right? People pay for this privilege. They pay their fees, etc. This process is supposed to be a well-run process. This is on public display for the whole world to see how America does, you know, this part of the immigration process. It's part of our laws. And as an American citizen, I'm absolutely embarrassed how badly you run this program. So it's embarrassing that we would do this on the world stage. Anyway, all right, that's probably enough of that. Trump is probably going to try and deport me. Good luck to you, Mr. Trump. You know, good luck with that deportation. But in the meantime, yeah, just, you know, get this sorted out. I hope that was interesting to all of you that are perhaps new winners. There are about 4 times more new winners than there should be. And, you know, hopefully now you're a little bit better educated about what is happening. And I'm sorry this video has run so long, but there was a lot to explain. All right, everybody, have a good day. Bye-bye.